Hello and welcome to Nature Calling, a podcast of the World Wildlife Fund, WWF. This is Fasi Zaka speaking, and today we're doing a program on the illegal wildlife trade in Pakistan, its impacts, and what the scale of the problem is, what can be done about it. We have with us Uzma Khan, who's a consultant with the WWF, has done a lot of work in this area. So thank you, Uzma, for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Uzma, tell us, what is the scale of, I know that it's around $19 billion across the world, but what is the scale in Pakistan? Is Pakistan a big contributor?
Pakistan is a contributor in terms of few species, few groups, I would say. And those groups include freshwater turtles, falcons. So we are big on these two groups of animals. So just for an idea of the scale, we have data on confiscation, because you don't know what goes on. You can only have an estimate about the scale of the problem through confiscation data. So from Pakistan, for example, in 2015, there were about 5,700 turtles that were confiscated. Some of them were live, some of them were just parts of turtles, and they were being exported to all sorts of countries. For example, Bangkok is the transit, and then it goes to other countries, for example, Hong Kong and China. So if we just see the data from 2015, it's estimated that the price of the consignments confiscated were about 14 crores. So, 143 million Pakistani rupees was the worth of the confiscation just of turtles. So the scale, and we've seen that over the years, the turtle trade is increasing. So in the last 5-6 years, turtle trade has increased a lot, particularly for one species, which is the black spotted turtle. And it's popular as a pet, but also it's eaten. So yeah, it's increasing, and it's a mafia.
So one thing is that, we often hear that there's an insatiable demand in China for medicinal purposes, for a number of other purposes. Is any of this consumed in Pakistan?
Pakistan has, because we have surveyed markets just to understand if parts are consumed in Pakistan. We have seen that within the country, there is a demand for, let's say, fat of carnivore species. So, reech ki fat, ya lion ki fat. So, these are used for pains. They are also linked to their aphrodisiac properties. So, we find these things in the market. Now, if it's a local species product, we understand that it comes from black bear, which is a protected species in Pakistan. It would come from, let's say, spiny-tailed lizards, which are also protected. So, the fat comes out of those species and it's sold in the market. But what is alarming is that there are certain species which are exotic, which are not found in Pakistan. For example, tiger fat, lion fat, which you can also find in the market. It is alarming because, as I said, it's exotic, but the concern is, where is this coming from? And we feel that it's coming from the private breeding facilities, private animal facilities in Pakistan, which are legally allowed in certain provinces. And unfortunately, we don't have any regulation that says when an animal dies in a private facility, what should be done about it. How do you dispose it off? So what's the legal way of disposing of a dead animal when it comes from a private facility? And the monitoring is really, really weak. It is a matter of huge concern, and traceability is a big factor. And this is where the law needs to be strengthened.
So, Uzma, this is fascinating in terms of, this desire now for these animal fats or these from carnivorous animals. Is this something that maybe we're adopting, or is this just something that always existed?
It existed because obviously it's a traditional, you can say, medicine. It's a traditional usage which has continued. For example, in Pakistan, you still find, luxury shawls. That's how they're labeled, and they are chatus. So chatus shawls, you still find them in Pakistan. In the past, we have had designers who launched their chatus collections, and we obviously took actions. But you see, this is not a local species. Chatus comes from Chiru, which is a Tibetan antelope, but it's protected. It's illegal to bring it into Pakistan, but it happens, and there is a local market. So, in the time like 20, 30 years ago, it was rather common, but now it's protected and you cannot have it. But still the market exists. You can you can do an underhand, dealing with people. You can go to these big stores and you can ask for them, and if they consider that you are a potential buyer, they'll offer it to you. So again, this is part of it comes back to how although legally it's protected, but then it comes down to the capacity issues of our departments, whether they can apprehend it, whether they can monitor it, whether they can take strict actions. Because the actions are weaker, I think illegal wildlife trade and all this usage continues. If you go in the old Lahore area, you can find all these animal fats being openly sold. You can find, small thellas, small shops where these vendors are selling spiny tail lizard's fat, snake oil, for example.
So, Uzma, one question, and I'd wonder what your perspective on this as a policy specialist, is that if you do have these private animal breeding grounds, is that something to be encouraged if it puts pressure off natural sanctuaries?
No, it should be encouraged as long as it's related to some educational value. I know some really good private breeding facilities as well, and I think they are doing good work because they encourage visitors and there is an education element attached to it. There is good welfare and all that. But if it's so private, then basically what these animal breeders are breeding are those animals which are exotic. So if you are breeding tigers or if you are breeding lions, they don't have any value in terms of our national parks because you cannot release them here. They are not indigenous to Pakistan. But if they are breeding gharials and if they somehow have a reintroduction program, then they will add value. But they are not breeding gharials. They are breeding exotic animals, and they have they're very valuable because it's also a business venture for them. So yeah, if you are breeding tigers, you cannot release them in our national parks in Pakistan, and it's so difficult to release a carnivore and establish it back in a natural habitat. So I don't see their value. Most of them, I always say, they should be encouraged to open these facilities. They should invite school groups. They should have an education program. Otherwise, having a private farm just for the sake of breeding animals and selling them, it has no purpose to conservation.
So one more thing, Uzma, you mentioned that just for turtles alone, it was something like 14 crore rupees. All the people who are involved in this trade, how do you dissuade them when the financial numbers are a very real incentive? I mean, that must be one of the biggest challenges, is that how do you, one is enforcement, which is obviously good, but we're weak in that. But on the other hand, is there a way to actually get people to see that, there's a problem within this, but is there an alternative that would give them the same kind of livelihood that this is already doing?
The thing is that, as probably you would know, that United Nations labeled illegal wildlife trade as an organized crime. So this is back in 2013. And what they said is that if it's an organized crime, then it should have the same level of punishments as other organized crimes, which are, for example, human trafficking or drug dealing. So one thing is established, that Pakistan does not have very strong penalties this is a weak area. As far as I said it because when you say that is it the source of livelihood for local communities, I think very, very little, because as with any organized crime, there are certain people, that mafia that operates and gets benefit out of it, but local communities get very little. For example, I was once interviewing some community representative who themselves said, yes, we sometimes catch turtles for somebody. And they didn't know who, but they catch turtles. And I said, okay, what do you get? So they said sometimes 20 rupees, sometimes 50 rupees. So it's peanuts compared to what the person who's actually dealing with it will be getting, because each turtle can worth up to $350 in the international market, and 20, 30 to 50 rupees is nothing. You are right that even if there is an incentive of 20 rupees per turtle, it needs to be looked into and alternatives can be offered. And as far as WWF is concerned, we work a lot with fishermen communities to diversify their livelihood. So, there are some alternate source of income other than just fishing. But we still need an in-depth study into the drivers of illegal wildlife trade. What drives people to get involved? And how much do they get, because we know very little. And after 2013 is something that this came in the limelight and there were resources to study it well. Earlier there was not much going into this, so now internationally there is funding available to study it, to take some actions. So we hope that things will improve with more understanding of the issue and more work going into this area.
So another thing that I've seen in your work mentioned is that pangolins are quite in demand and they've been driven into a near extinction locally. What is it about the pangolin that is so appealing in the illegal wildlife trade? And number two, is there also a fear of pangolins locally, that it's a misunderstood animal?
Both. So locally, yes, people think, we have had incidences where they'll say, "Koi bala aa gayi hai." We got a phone call, "Ji, gaon mein koi bala aa gayi hai." So they were not familiar of the species at all, and it once I don't want to name the institution, but it's a very prestigious institution in Lahore. And because they make burrows during the monsoon season, the animal came out from the outskirts of Lahore, and students actually killed it because they thought it's some really, really dangerous animal. Yeah, it's so sad. So as you said, that there's a fear, or people are familiar with the species. This is true. And the other thing is that it's in the international market, it's very valuable because of various reasons. The scales are apparently they are made into a powder. There are capsules of scales powder available, and they are linked to various vital organ diseases. The animal itself is eaten. So there are various problems. Traditionally, in the salt range area, they make like katavis out of the scale and put it around the neck of their livestock, and apparently it protects from disease. So communities also have their beliefs and myths and whatnot. So yes, so there are various factors, but it's a huge international. There's a huge international market for the pangolin, and it was regarded as the most traded mammal species by the international forum, which we call CITES. So yes, there is no other animal which has been traded so much. There's data that says that more than 100,000 seizures in the last 5 years. So it's a hugely traded animal.
So this question is slightly facetious, but I'm almost a bit serious about this. Is one way to curb this illegal wildlife trade is to ensure that Viagra is as publicized as possible?
Well, pangolin is not known for its aphrodisiac qualities, but yes, Pakistan has witnessed one extinction, and that is of the gharial, which was a fish-eating crocodile. So it's we have seen its extinction in our lifetime, and that there was the nose bulge, which was called the ghara, had aphrodisiac properties. And yes, so yeah, why not? I think everybody should have access to Viagra and alcohol and everything, and then it's their own choice whether they take it or not take it. So I think Pakistan should have that option and should be progressive enough, and we should talk about it openly rather than being shy about it
and causing extinctions. So just another question also is that in terms of going out to, so you've got animal fats which for carnivores that are being used, and some of these animals are religiously they're not sanctioned for consumption. So has that ever been a lever to try and dissuade the end consumer, at least in Pakistan?
I think it helps because, for example, in the case of turtles, we know that it's we don't know any one or never encountered an incident where people are eating turtles in Pakistan because we are largely a Muslim society. But we know that in Pakistan it is offered to the visitors who from other countries who work in Pakistan, and it's widely known. And so yes, I think local consumption in some way is protecting species because of halal haram issues. But then there are other species that are exploited because they are halal. But that's not illegal wildlife trade, it's illegal hunting. For example, we have lost a lot of the population of grey goral, which is a Himalayan antelope, which is linked to the consumption. So yeah, it depends what species are we talking about, but certainly in case of turtles, we have not seen local consumption. But locally, the problem with turtle is there's a bit of pet trade, and every now and then there is a raid, and turtles are confiscated from a pet store. And it's a very, very regular thing, but I personally think this is not going to solve the problem, because you have the turtles, you confiscate them, and then there are more turtles, you confiscate more. So I think it's also to do with awareness. People should know, which I think you have a very important role. Media, certainly, they have a very important role in highlighting that if we keep wild animals as pets, we are ourselves contributing to their decline. And this is something which people should understand, that we are causing the extinction. Human beings, we think, we love turtles, we want to have them as a pet, but we are actually contributing to their extinction.
One thing I found really fascinating, and it was slightly presumptive of me, which I thought that maybe local communities are quite involved in illegal wildlife trade, and your perspective on that it's actually organized crime and it's a much bigger racket than that. So when it takes the form of organized crime and it's got a certain sophistication and maybe even a certain brutality, the question is, what kind of punishments exist and what would you be recommending that would actually have some value in terms of dissuading people that this is something that doesn't pay?
I think it's a very important point that you have raised. The thing is that Pakistan CITES is a convention where we are bound to certain regulations when it comes to the international trade, and Pakistan signed it in 1976. But we made our law, the punishments and everything under international trade we made a law for that in 2012. So imagine how much time we took in making the law. So now we have a Trade Control Act. But the thing is that Act is still waiting for its integration into our provincial legal system. There are some rules that have to be integrated. The rules have been developed, but they are still in process. So the law has not been integrated in the provincial legal system. But I think it's a great step ahead that we have this law, and we have punishments like from $500,000 to $1 million if you are trying to illegally trade a CITES listed species, and there can be imprisonment for up to 2 years. But this is the cross-border, international border trade. Now, when it comes to local, in the provincial system, we have very, very low penalties. So, for example, the penalties can be from 10,000 to 50,000. Recently, what happened was that a common leopard was skinned in Abbottabad district. And the person was given, it was, through legal system, you don't have, you can, it's called compound when the local, wildlife department punishes the person and asks for a compensation. So they fined him 110K. So 1,10,000 rupees usko fine hua. Now, the worth of a leopard skin is a lot more than 1,10,000 rupees. And in the past matlab ke kuch arsa pehle, there was fine of about 25,000 rupees, which is extremely low. So in the KP Wildlife Act, for example, which is the revised act, there can be punishment up to 45,000. Agar aap usko court mein le jaye, which is the legal process that you take the person to the court. The person says, "Nahi, I'm not going to give you the fine that you're asking." So the case goes to the court, and the court can give the maximum penalty of 45,000 rupees. So it's peanuts. So I think the penalties need to be revised, and they need to be so high that people are discouraged that if we are caught, we are in huge trouble. We will either go to jail, because jail is something which is also an option, but people go for maximum a month or so, 2 months, and then they get the bail. Because I think this also highlights that we need to empower the judiciary, that they need to take wildlife crimes extremely seriously. They have to be strict punishments. So if they come across a case which involves illegal wildlife trade, strict punishments should be given, maximum that can be given under the law, which can be 2 years of imprisonment. So somebody will feel that, 2 saal ki jail, but will be willing to probably give 45,000 or 1 lakh rupees as a fine. Let's say 2 lakh ki jail is 2 years imprisonment is a big thing. So I think wo hamare system mein, that's something which is lacking, because hamare system mein jail is something that hardly happens, or when it happens, it's for a very short duration.
Okay. Now, another thing that sort of strikes me is that in some of the work that you guys are doing, you're trying to save the snow leopard, the fox, the jackal, wolves, otters. Now, some animals, humans tend to anthropomorphize. They try to look at them in a cutesy way. Some animals have a harder time of eliciting sympathy in terms of, their near extinction, like the pangolin we talked about. So when you work with communities, or even say potentially people who are doing poaching, how do you dissuade them from, say, either killing or using for their parts animals like, or the Indian cobra, other venomous or non-venomous snakes? I mean, how do you get them to recognize where they might see them as legitimate pests?
We have not really worked on snakes because we our focus is a little different. And snake trade is internationally, from Pakistan as a source country is not a huge issue. But your question is very valid. That how do you convince people when it's not a cute, cuddly animal? And I can give you example of the vulture. There are two species that are critically endangered in Pakistan. Three species actually, but two of a group which we are focusing on. And now, people, for a lot of people, it's like nobody likes vultures. They are not cute and cuddly. They eat dead animals. So all these factors go against them. But what we highlight then is their ecological importance. They control the spread of disease. They consume dead animals. So they are like sanitizers of nature. So then we play on this card, their ecological value, their services, their role. We highlight them. In the similar way, crocodiles, for example, is another species which people are scared of. They don't like them, but then they have the same function in the river ecosystem. They clean the river. So that's the sort of information we use for our messages to communities, our messages to schools, to raise awareness about them. And then we say we need to protect them, otherwise we are gone. Our livestock will have disease, our livestock will suffer. Then it helps. And we are working in Nagar Park on the vulture population.
Now, Uzma, another thing that I'd like to be, I'm just wondering is that if you're in a community, you're in Karachi, you're in Lahore, you have some knowledge that either an animal is about to be killed because people do not understand the animal, or that you have some knowledge of a poaching operation or the illegal trade being conducted, who do you speak to?
We immediately call because it happens. So we immediately inform the wildlife department because they have the legal mandate. I wish I had some legal mandate to do this because this is frustrating to be, when you're part of a non-governmental organization, you don't have the legal authority. But so we immediately call the wildlife department, but in most of the cases we also accompany. And they also like it because it also gives them, that cover and, that, okay, they were not, because they are always accused of being involved. And so they also appreciate if we are with them. So if possible, we also go with them. And it has happened many times that we went. And we also help them in the release process when a confiscated animal is released back into the habitat. So yes, they keep us on board, and that's how our action is, that we try to go ourselves as well, and we inform the wildlife authority immediately.
But if there was a student in Lahore and that animal was being killed at that time, how do they get in touch with the WWF or the wildlife department?
We can only tell when we are informed. But in this particular case that you're referring, when a pangolin was killed, the students were, a bit aggressive towards the animal, somebody called us and said that students are throwing stones. This is what was happening. And we immediately went. But that facility, that institution is about 25 minutes away from us. So by the time we reached, the animal had died. It was led to death. Okay. But it was really sad. And we talked to the students. I was like, what have you guys done? They were quite embarrassed. But the thing is that they were really scared. They didn't know. And I think this is also our responsibility, that we should raise the awareness of people, because I think students watch National Geographic and all that, but there are very few programs related to the biodiversity within Pakistan. So, we need more and more. And we often raise this, but then when you talk to media, they often say that it's not a sellable program. So I think there has to be a regular wildlife program on television. But when we talk to them, they say, the rating, we won't get the rating. I've spoken to media many times. And this is because all the political shows and all the heated discussions between different political parties get all the attention, and nobody is bothered about what's happening to our wildlife, our environment. And this is what we need to raise.
I agree, absolutely. Just a last question. So, in the immediate next 5 to 10 years, what is it that you wish Pakistan would do, in particular, to curb the wildlife trade that already exists within its borders?
Okay, there are a few things. For example, as I said before, that we have a really good act, which is Trade Control Act 2012. Now, this needs to be integrated in the provincial legal system, and I think much before that it should happen, and we are trying to push the process. We have already reviewed the rules, and so that is something that needs to be done immediately, so that exotic species could be confiscated if they are present illegally in Pakistan anywhere. Second thing which must happen is the standard of welfare in the private breeding facilities, and a proper legal system on how you dispose of the dead animals in private facilities so that they do not enter illegal wildlife trade. That side is really weak, and we have given our recommendations because it was part of a court case which was related to the showcasing of wild animals in political campaigns. So it was a case related to that, and under that we gave our recommendations, and this is one of those recommendations, that standard of welfare and disposal of dead animals needs to be looked into in private facilities. So these are the two things that I foresee that will happen within the next 5 years, and it will help a lot. Plus, I think there is also an issue that we see, which is that CITES Management Authority in Pakistan, which is giving permits for trophy hunting or any, for legal trade of animals from international to other countries out of Pakistan. So they have a different mandate, which is protecting wildlife species. But then there is Ministry of Commerce, which consistently says if there are fur jackets trade, it will be good for Pakistan. So they have been pushing for leather jackets export with fur trimmings, and there has been some, rift. So there needs to be some collaboration. They need to work together, and they should have some, similar mandate. They are Ministry of Commerce. They also should feel that we need to protect species, not because Leather Association of Pakistan wants something. They should not pressurize CITES Management Authority or Ministry of Climate Change. So, that collaboration needs to exist, and I think that will also happen and should happen pretty soon.
Okay, just before we go, very quickly, one last question, and this just occurred to me, which is that how does somebody like yourself get involved in this and develop this passion for wildlife?
I think I should say bachpan ka shauk, like a standard answer. But I think it's true. I was always passionate about animals. But I think one factor was that my mother always showed us National Geographic. We were not watching anything else when we were growing up. We were watching National Geographic. So I think I was sensitized from earlier on, and that's why I think media have a very important role. we need to sensitize, and this is what needs to be done. So I think if you know something, you will try to. It's a very famous saying: if you know the animal, if you understand it, only then you will try to save it. So it's a very important thing, and yes, I think education helps a lot.
All right, thank you so much. That is Uzma Khan for the WWF, speaking about the illegal wildlife trade in Pakistan. Thank you for taking out the time, and I found it truly illuminating. And I hope to have you on the show once again.
Pleasure being here and talking to you. Thank you so much for raising this issue.
All right, thank you so much. This is the WWF's Nature Calling. We'll be back soon with another podcast on wildlife in Pakistan.